BookTube, it's Angie. Welcome. So this is the video that I had sort of hinted at in my, I believe it was my March shelf picking video, where I had mentioned that there was an idea I had for a new series of videos. This is the start of that. This is just going to be a series where I talk about books I've read that have to do with the personal lives and the backstories behind famous authors we know, and maybe where some of their inspirations for their stories came from. So a lot of the books I talk about on here will be bios and autobios that I come across, but I was thinking every so often I may just include novels that are based off of the lives of famous writers and well-known part of their lives or something like that. I don't know, haven't worked out all the details yet, but to start it off, I am going to start with this book, Wildly Romantic, by Catherine M. Andronik, I believe it is. I actually got the idea to do this series through this book. When I was about halfway through it, the idea sort of popped into my head that, like, oh hey, you know what might be a cool idea? And here we are. It's a history book, and I was kind of surprised to find that it's actually a YA history book, because most YA nonfiction I find has like a more, I don't know, childlike looking cover, or a cover that is obvious it's geared towards people in their teens or younger. And this one just looked like a regular bio or history book that anybody would pick up, and I didn't realize it was geared towards YA until I started reading about the author and looking at the background of this book. But I was actually impressed, because it's actually a really well put together book, and I think even adult readers are going to benefit from this, because there was a lot I pulled from it. So this book talks about the Romantic poets, the famous ones, like Keats and Byron and Wordsworth and Coleridge and a couple other people that were involved in their lives. And it just goes through little bits of them. It's a really short read. I mean, it's one of those books where it's like a number of pages in the back are all just reference notes. So I think the book itself is just under 250 pages, and a number of the pages are actually just the poems of the famous people they're talking about. So you can, if you're not familiar with their work, you can have a taste of what they were famous for, which I thought was pretty cool. But yeah, I just thought I would go through some of the cool stuff I learned. Some of it I was pretty familiar with from my lit classes in high school and college, but there were some things that I wasn't so familiar with. So I just thought I would go over some of that and hash out some of the stuff they talk about in here. So one of the first people they talk about is Samuel Coleridge, or Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Coleridge is probably most famous for his poems like Kubla Khan and Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which I think, I don't know about you, but I think when I was in high school, pretty much everybody that was in an AP English class at some point had to read Rime of the Ancient Mariner. I didn't really come across Kubla Khan until I was in college, I think. But aside from reading his poetry, I didn't really know a whole lot about Coleridge. And so this book gave me a pretty good background on him. One of the things that cracked me up was they talk about how in his day, I forget who it was, but there was somebody who described Coleridge as being a mouth breather and a big lumbering man with a carcass of a face. And they have a picture of him, and he's not that damn bad. I mean, he's not gonna be on People's Sexiest Men or anything, but he's not that bad. I don't know, carcass of a face seemed kind of harsh. Poor guy. Coleridge later in his life ended up suffering from a lot of mental disorders that we know more about today, but probably they didn't really know how to address that well in his time. He had a lot of social anxiety, a lot of depression. I think he battled with alcoholism at one point. He had an opium addiction that probably stemmed from trying to manage his depression. There's even speculation that he might have been bipolar, possibly. But a lot of it stemmed from the fact that he just I don't know what it was specifically, but he seemed to have a lifetime of just physical pain. He was just all over pain all the time for most of his life, which probably also is where the opium addiction came in, because they do mention in here that his doctors at the time were treating his physical pain ailments with laudanum, which is heavily loaded with opium, and it's, you know, famous for being one of those substances that once it's in, at least back in the day when it was used as heavily as it was, once it's in your system, it's really hard to get out. So yeah, he got pretty messed up with that. But I thought it was cool that he, you know, on here, on BookTube, we hear a lot about people saying, you know, oh, I wish I could get paid for reading books all the time, or, you know, it was funny when I was growing up, and even when I was in college, I remember my very first day of my very first college lit course. My professor walks in and goes into this long speech about how he's glad we're there, but we're wasting our time, and you're not going to do anything with a lit degree, you're not going to do anything with an English degree, you're going to end up teaching high school English, and you're not going to be a famous book reviewer, New York Times isn't going to give a damn about you, and he just went on and on. And yeah, it was kind of a rude awakening to have that right off the bat, like my first day in college. But I thought it was funny that in this book they talk about Coleridge actually did make a living, although a meager one, at being a book reviewer. The way they describe his work, I thought was pretty funny. It said, one job Coleridge was actually doing and getting paid for was reviewing books, mostly the Gothic novels that were the 19th century's answer to Stephen King. Indeed, Coleridge commented, I am almost weary of the terrible dungeons and old castles and solitary houses by the seaside, and caverns and woods and extraordinary characters and all the tribe of horror and mystery. Notice he said almost. And he was writing poetry at a rate of about 50 lines a day. But he wasn't popular or successful, and he saw it plainly that literature was not a profession which I could expect to live by. So I just thought it was cool that even back then, people were, or maybe even more so back then, people were struggling to do what they love, and even though they weren't making a huge living out of it, they said, screw it, this is what makes me happy, I'm gonna figure it out. Yeah, Coleridge didn't end up having the happiest life, but I thought it was cool that, you know, he was persistent in living with what made him happy, even if it wasn't, you know, rainbows and pots of gold every day. And there were a lot of things he struggled with day to day. He still followed through with what made him happy, at least when, you know, his inner demons weren't bogging him down. But I don't know, I could find something to relate in that. The book also talks about how while Samuel Coleridge was being a struggling poet and book reviewer, he somewhere along the line became introduced to William Wordsworth, the famous poet, and became friends with him. And then I think it was somehow Coleridge was friends with Thomas de Quincey, who is famous for his book, his memoir, Confessions of an English Opium Eater, which I read and reviewed on my blog a couple years back. I will try to see if I can track down the review. But yeah, that was an interesting read. But Wordsworth, he developed sort of a tentative friendship with de Quincey. But they mentioned in this book that as Wordsworth got older, he got more and more conservative, and he got to where he probably got to a point in his life where he's like, you know, I just can't associate with this crowd anymore. Maybe not because he had anything against the way they were living, but maybe, I mean, after a while, you just, even now, people get to a point where sometimes you do outgrow your friends and you get to different places in life and you're like, we have no reason to hang out anymore. We are not in the same place in life anymore. We don't have anything in common anymore. I mean, it happens every once in a while. You just grow apart from people. So that may have been what happened to them. In that same time, unfortunately, that was around the time that Kinsey's opium addiction, which kind of came and went throughout his life, he was in another downslide when that friendship with Wordsworth sort of petered out. Wordsworth started to hear that Kinsey was starting to slum it again. I think originally Kinsey came from, I don't know if he came from a really wealthy background, but I believe he came from at least a respectable background, and then the opium addiction kind of screwed up his life and he got into sort of bad circles. And in Kinsey's memoir, Confessions of an English Opium Eater, he talks a lot about this prostitute he had befriended and wandered around town with, and then she just sort of disappeared one day. Even though they had spent months hanging out, she just gone one day. And in the book he talks for pages about how he can't get over not being able to talk to her anymore. And so I don't know how much of that played into this, because that part of his life isn't even mentioned in this, but it does mention that one of the things that really bothered Wordsworth, that may have been a big decision in him ending the friendship, is Wordsworth got word that Kinsey had knocked up a servant girl and tried to do right by her and ended up marrying her and having the child and everything. But it wasn't, they said in the book, it wasn't Kinsey's opium addiction, it wasn't the fact that he had impregnated this girl or anything like that. The thing that bothered Wordsworth the most was that he felt that the servant girl was beneath Kinsey's station. Or, as he said it, Wordsworth didn't disown Kinsey because of his deception, or because he was an opium addict, or even because he had an illegitimate child, which would have been hypocritical considering Caroline Vallon, which I believe is somebody Wordsworth had a illegitimate child with, possibly. I forget that part, but it said Wordsworth disowned him because he had married a girl so far beneath his station. That's what Wordsworth had that issue with. It's like, it's not that you're addicted to opium or that you have an illegitimate child. No, it's that you married a servant. It's just like, I don't know. People, the way people thought back then is just, it still stumps me when I read about it. So Wordsworth doesn't get talked about a whole lot in this book. He does pop up in other people's bios in this book, which is one thing I thought was kind of cool, is when you're reading this, you're learning about individual poets of the time, but every so often you see a connection with, oh, this person came into this person's life, and then you read about them, and then they go into the next person's life, and you see how they all sort of ran into each other at some different points in each other's lives, which I thought was really neat, because you learn about them individually, but a lot of times in school you don't really learn about them associating with each other that much. And then it goes in to talk about the relationship between William Godwin and Percy Bysshe Shelley. William Godwin and Percy Bysshe Shelley. There is a crazy relationship. See if I can get this family tree right, because it gets a little bit muddled around Godwin and Shelley. So you may have heard of Mary Wollstonecraft, who is the mother of Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. Mary Wollstonecraft is probably most well known for her book Dedication on the Rights of Women, I believe it's called. It's pretty well known as being, I think, the very first non-fiction feminist piece. I think is, or at least one of the first. Mary Wollstonecraft went through a good part of her life. I mean, she didn't live a super long time, but she went through a good part of her life kind of open as far as her relationships went. She went for a while without really believing in marriage, and so she had a couple different passionate relationships before she got involved with William Godwin. By the time she had met William Godwin, I believe she already had a child with another guy who had abandoned her, I think. It's been a while since I've read about her life, but she meets up with William Godwin. He convinces her that they could make the marriage thing work. Even though before that, William Godwin had also been sort of a free love advocate until he has his daughter Mary Shelley with Mary Wollstonecraft, and I believe Mary Wollstonecraft died giving birth to Mary Shelley. And when Mary Shelley grows up, I think that when she gets to her teen years, that's when she catches the attention of Percy Bysshe Shelley, although when they meet, obviously she's known as Mary Godwin. Well, when they meet, Percy Bysshe Shelley was already married to another woman, and William Godwin was all cool with the free love thing until it came to Percy locking eyes on his teenage daughter. And then he's like, you know what? I'm not down with you being married and looking at my teenage daughter. I'm not that into free love. But by that time, you know, the hearts and birds and things had already started fluttering around their heads, and William Godwin couldn't really do much about it, and Percy and Mary end up falling in love. I don't know how Mary was cool with it, but she ends up having a side thing with Percy, even though Percy's very open with his first wife about being with Mary. He spends a lot of time away from the house. In this book, they talk about how whenever he goes back home to see his wife, she keeps ending up knocked up. But then he'll go back to Mary and have a thing with her. And then he just keeps going back and forth. And Percy is just like, it's what I do. And I don't know, he didn't strike me as all that apologetic about it. He's just, you know, he acted like they should both be lucky that they got him or something. I don't know. An incident in here where William Godwin was trying really hard to curb the attention that Percy was putting on Mary and trying to keep them apart, and Percy ends up convincing not only Mary but Mary's half-sister, I believe it was, to steal away in the middle of the night and go on this rendezvous. And I forget where they went, but they just stayed away for like weeks on end until they ran out of money. And they had to kind of come home with their tail between their legs. But they mentioned in the story that while they're on this trip having a grand old time, Percy actually contacts his first wife and says, hey, why don't you join us? And yeah, that didn't go down so well, as you can imagine. Shelley and Wordsworth both apparently were very into the whole wild and free parenting style. Very like live and let live, let the kids do what they naturally want to do, don't really put any restrictions or rules on them. But Percy's first wife did not really share that opinion. She thought that there should be boundaries and guidelines because that's your job as a parent, to put that there. That's what parenting is you give them guidelines and boundaries, and you know, that's what separates them from being crazy wild wolf children. She let him have his way up to a point. He did name one of their children after a character in one of his poems and went along with his ideas to a certain extent. But Andronik in this book also points out that at one point Percy's wife puts her foot down, and because Percy tries to sell her on the idea of indefinite breastfeeding and she's just like, no, I'm not breastfeeding this kid till he's like 12. No. So I thought that was kind of funny, that even, because that's still sort of a modern idea even now, that when people come out with it, that's sort of considered an alternative route of parenting even now. So it's kind of funny that back then, you know, Percy was pushing that lifestyle. It also mentions in this book that this is one thing that I wasn't aware of, but apparently Percy Bysshe Shelley did have a little bit of a rep for being kind of temperamental, kind of easy to set off, and apparently Andronik in this book points out that it could have stemmed from some of his childhood experiences, because it says he goes to a boys' school, and it talks about how it wasn't easy for him to fit in around a lot of other boys. It says, he seemed like an easy target for bullies with his fair curls, delicate features, and a squeaky voice. But the other boys quickly learned that Bysshe Shelley's temper had a short fuse, and when he was provoked, which didn't take much, he could strike out violently. More than once at mealtime, he whirled about at a boy, calling him names, and thrust a knife or fork through his hand right into the table. This is childhood Shelley. It also goes on to say that once he was in school, he developed a fascination with chemistry. Said he continued his studies back in his room and learned things that teachers tended to omit from their lessons, such as that certain chemicals in certain combinations could produce incredible explosions. He was encouraged in his little experiments by one teacher, who may or may not have been aware that his young pupil was twisting chemistry towards alchemy, philosophy towards parapsychology. It didn't take long for other teachers to learn of Bysshe's fascination for things that went boom. And it goes on to say that he also had a fascination with electricity and reanimation and things like that, which I thought was interesting because I have read theories that say that the things that are in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein may have actually been, some people contribute it to being more of Percy Bysshe Shelley's idea, because he did work as an editor on her novel. So they said there's possibility, I've read theories that say there's a possibility that a lot of the ideas we attribute to her were actually his. It's just a theory out there, but when I read that, I thought that was an interesting correlation to that theory. As we learn more about Percy Bysshe Shelley and Mary Godwin, who later became Mary Shelley, in this book, we also find out that there was a dark turn in their story together, or a couple dark turns actually, that I don't think get put into history books very often, but it mentions that while Mary Godwin and Percy Bysshe Shelley were having their little adventure with Mary's half-sister, she had another half-sister, I believe. Might have been on Godwin's side, possibly, I forget which side it was on, but another one of her half-sisters at that time, they discovered later, was at the same time, ended up checking herself into a hotel and committing suicide by overdosing on opium, some sort of opiates, I believe. And they don't really explain why, but I don't know. My idea is maybe that with everything going on with Mary and her other sister, and the father having all that attention on them, perhaps this other sister was feeling a little bit neglected. I don't know, maybe she had depression issues, maybe she felt like the third wheel child. I don't remember where she fell in age-wise, if she was the middle child or youngest child or what. I believe Mary was the oldest. So, yeah, I don't know, but it was really sad. Not too long after that period, police also discovered the body of Percy's first wife in the Serpentine River, which is in Hyde Park in London, or goes through Hyde Park. They can attribute that to a suicide, or at least they assume it was a suicide, because his wife did leave a note as far as what to do with the care of the children. And that turned into a whole big thing, because after investigation and everything was going on, Percy's lawyer advised him that he would have an easier time maintaining custody of his children if he were to remarry. And so, as we know now, he went and married Mary Shelley, but the parents of his first wife, the grandparents of his legitimate children, had contested the custody. I don't think that there was a ruling. I think that Percy had put in, I don't know how to explain that because I don't have kids, but you know, whatever they do for Percy to get full legal custody of his children without question, as that process was going on, the parents of his first wife were contesting the trial, and it turned into this big custody trial with the grandparents trying to get custody of their grandchildren because they said that with everything Percy was doing and being back and forth, he was an unfit father. I could see. This, at least from what I read in this book and some other ones, a bit shady on the fatherhood angle. But it turned out that from what I read, I guess the judge that was overseeing that case probably just got sick of the back and forth, because he eventually ruled that neither one of them got custody. He actually fostered the children out to a local doctor and said that Percy and the grandparents could have visitation rights, but neither one of them would have full custody of the children, which is sad, but the way it sounded probably was the best move. There's no definitive documentation that shows that Percy actually made any visits to his children, which is not to say that he didn't. This book just says that there's no paperwork that officially says he ever went to visit his children, which is, that was the case, it's pretty jacked. So yeah, when I got down to the end of this book, I was like, oh, wasn't a huge fan of his before, but now I'm really not. So then the other big scandalous story they go over in this book is the famous Lord Byron himself. Byron is arguably maybe one of those poets that we think we know the most about, but really probably don't really know much of anything about. Because again, he was one that didn't live very long, but got a lot of life in the years he did live. Not necessarily in a good way. But yeah, once you read this book, you're probably gonna find it kind of funny that he's considered one of the Romantic poets, and you know how many generations of men love wooing women by quoting "she walks in beauty like the night" and all of that. And then you read about what the guy was like as a person, and you're like, oh man, that guy has douche stamp all over him. But he's considered so romantic. So yeah, about Lord Byron. I mean, I had read in books before that his romantic reputation might have been a little bit hyped, but I didn't realize just how bizarre he actually was as a person from what we know now. It turns out that he had a lot of quirks to him that, you know, if it were just the quirks, it'd be alright. He had some odd things about, you know, they mentioned when he actually did get, he was famous for having bedded all these women, but when he actually got around to settling down and marrying one of them, he had this thing about he didn't like to watch women eat, and so he never sat down to a meal with his wife because he was just so grossed out by the sight of women eating, which I thought was a weird thing to latch onto, but everybody's got their things. But it wasn't even so much that, it was he was another one that it seems had a really just like trigger temper. He struggled with what we now recognize as mental illness. I'm not sure what they would have referred to it back then other than like, damn dude. Mental illness and anger management problems. This I didn't know. He apparently was really self-conscious about his weight. He was only, I think in this book they said he didn't even reach 5'9" in his lifetime in height, and he struggled with ballooning weight all the time, or very up and down weight. And they said at one point he got very self-conscious because I think it said he got up to like 200 or topped 200 or something like that. And so he was always really self-conscious about that, and it was also triggered by this incident he had. I think it said it was with his first serious girlfriend. You know, before he got the rep, he ended up having the first girlfriend that he could actually say, "This is my girlfriend." There was an incident, I think when he was in his teens. They said the girl was standing in a circle with a number of her girlfriends, and Byron is walking up behind her, and you know, he's probably really happy in the moment, like, oh, I'm gonna go see my girl. And then as he's walking up to her, he hears her say to her friends, she calls him a cripple. And it just apparently broke him inside that this girl he was really enamored with at the time, that's how she saw him. One of his feet was a club foot that he never totally had fixed, and so he always had one slightly gimpy leg. I don't know, I suspect that incident probably sort of triggered the Lothario personality he ended up becoming famous for. Because it's kind of like, I'm going to put up this shield, I don't care about women, I'm not going to get hurt by women because I'm going to say I don't care about them that deeply anymore, and so I'm going to hurt them before they hurt me, or I don't know, something along that mentality to protect himself. She puts it in here, Byron was establishing his reputation as a daring and dashing ladies' man. Girls and eventually women saw in him a sad, lost, searching soul they could save with their love. It was irresistible, and it was a carefully developed persona that would serve his purposes well all his life. Because back then, man recognized that us girls are suckers for a project guy. Not so much when we get older, but when we're really young, we all want the project guy that we can save. But as they say in here, Byron didn't want women to save him. He wanted them to provide him with a good time. And it goes on to say that as far as his unconditional love, he saved that for his animals. He lavished on his dogs and his horses and gave them unconditional love. But when it came to his wife and his girlfriends and lovers and whatnot, he always had a distance and a bit of an edge to him, like, you know, you've served your purpose, you can go now. And it all probably stemmed from this one chick calling him a cripple. Which is funny that it seems like that incident put a chip on his shoulder for the rest of his life, but somehow he still managed to knock out those poems that wooed so many women for generations. It's crazy. I was a little bit weirded out to find out that one of his conquests ended up being his own niece, that the relationship went on long enough that he eventually ended up impregnating her. That was a little... that made me feel a little bit dirty. To know that, you know, this guy that's known for being a poet is in there deflowering his niece. It's just... that was hard to read. They also mentioned that, I believe it was one of Mary Shelley's, I don't remember if it was her sister or her cousin, but there was a family connection between him and Mary Shelley too. Like, it was either her sister or her cousin that also ended up being a conquest of Lord Byron, and he got her pregnant too, apparently. Aside from the you know, impregnating your niece creepy thing, I think I was most disturbed at reading about his insane rages he went through. He said it would just stem, like, spur of the moment, just anything could set him off. And one of the scariest instances they talk about in here is when his wife comes to him and tells him she's pregnant, which for most couples is kind of a beautiful moment. With him, it turns out that he was not a fan of children, and he ends up pointing a gun in her face and threatening to kill her for getting herself pregnant. Which I thought was like, were you not there? It's not immaculate conception. She's telling you it's yours. Which I thought was... Yeah, so his wife ends up taking the child they already had. This was her second pregnancy she was notifying him of. She ends up taking the child and running, understandably. Smart move. I don't know if they ever officially got divorced. I don't think they did. But she ends up never living with him again. after he and his wife had split up, Byron decides to move to Venice and live in his Venice estate for a while. His daughter is sent to live with him for a while. It's bizarre because Jane had named the daughter Alba, but for some reason, when Alba goes to live with her father decides he doesn't like that name anymore, and now she will be known as Clara Allegra, which had to be really confusing for a little girl, but I guess she goes with it. Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley end up visiting Byron in Venice, and they're having a grand old time, except for while they're there, a typhus outbreak goes through the town and sadly ends up killing Alba, or Clara Allegra, and Mary and Percy's son William. And Mary Shelley falls into this deep depression because again, with Mary being wife number 2, Percy had this thing about constantly keeping his wives knocked up, just almost without a break. Mary goes through a number of miscarriages, and then the children she does have that come out in healthy births, the majority of them don't live past their toddler years, and I think she has, I forget the exact number, but I think she ends up having at least like 4 or 5 kids, at least, that never make it out of toddler years. She does end up having one. I think to take her mind off the situation, Percy gets the idea that, hey, Mary should work as a copy editor. Why don't you proofread my book? And then he gets her to proofread Byron's stuff, and so she makes work out of that, and it's during this time she's working as an editor for her husband and Byron that her husband decides to go on this sailing trip with his buddies. They got caught up in a storm and they went missing for 10 days before I'm not sure what happened to his friends, but Percy's body ended up being washed up on the shore. Byron and Mary came out to claim the body, but at the time of Percy's death there was a bit of a outbreak fear going through England, and they had this law that said if anybody washed up on the shore, in order to contain them, because you didn't know what they might be carrying, the bodies had to be buried pretty much right there on the beach, at least until other arrangements could be made, but you could not bring them directly from the shore into town until things could be investigated. So they end up burying Shelley right there on the shore where they found him for like 2 or 3 months, I think. And then Lord Byron ends up going back after a few months, and they talk about how he brings this portable furnace with him, which I don't know if that's really creepy or a really dedicated friend, that they would track down a portable furnace attached to like a horse cart to come cremate their friend on the beach. Lord Byron comes back out with a couple of his other buddies, and Mary digs Percy back up and cremates him right on the beach, right there. It seems alright until they mentioned that when they were getting near the end of the process, Lord Byron tried to grab the skull of Percy Bysshe Shelley as a souvenir to take back to his house, and thankfully one of his friends was like, dude, that's weird. No, you're not gonna make a souvenir out of your friend. Come on, put it in. It was kind of odd, but, and a little macabre, but with everything else they had talked about in Byron, maybe it wasn't really out of character for him, but I thought it was weird. But the one thing that was really bizarre is they mentioned that they were able to cremate everything normally with Percy's remains, except for his heart. His heart would not burn for some reason, and so they ended up getting that out of the furnace, and they boxed it and sent it to Mary, who eventually had it buried in London, I believe. And then Percy's ashes were sent to Rome and laid to rest near where Keats was buried, who is also mentioned in this book, but I didn't really get into him because there wasn't a lot of big scandalous things to talk about with Keats compared to the other people. But the interesting tie-in is that when they found Percy's body, he had been out to sea for a while, and so they couldn't identify him by his face, but they were able to identify him by his clothes, and they recognized a collection of Keats poems that were in his jacket. And that's how they ended up identifying him. It's kind of sad that when all of this happened, when Percy died in this sailing accident, he was only 30 at the time. Mary was 25, I believe, and she had an infant son. Even then, she had become pregnant again, and this infant son she had at the time of the death of Percy was the one child, I believe the only one, that ended up living into adulthood. Ironically, the child that survived was Percy's namesake, that they also named Percy. There's a pretty well-known painting that was done of Percy's sort of impromptu funeral with his friends that I will put here. And also, if you are interested, you can check out, I put the link down below. I won't put it in the video because the poem is kind of long, but there is a poem that Byron wrote commemorating the death of his friend Percy. The poem was called "I'll Go a Rovin' No More," and I will link that below for anyone interested. Yeah, that was, I think that's enough craziness for one bit, right? It's wild. You know, I'm not the most die-hard poetry fan, but it was really interesting to read about these backstories behind them and learn where some of the inspiration for a lot of the poems we know today came from. And you know, I think it's kind of cool to learn about these people, and you know, not I don't mean this to sound mean, but I actually like being able to take these literary figures off their pedestals sometimes and just look at them as people. I think that makes their works even more profound when we read them, when we can understand that they were not gods, they were not invincible, they went through crap too. And I don't know, it just, to me anyway, it seems like it makes their works more relatable, and it also makes the things we go through not quite so bad sometimes when we see people have been going through this for generations. Maybe not on the scale of some of the things I just mentioned in this video, but I'm sure we'll see a lot of commonalities as we go on with this. So thanks for trying out this series, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.